A routine eviction turns explosive when a cop discovers the black tenant is the building's rightful owner, facing relentless harassment from a disgraced landlord. Lies unravel, and deep-seated prejudices come to light, forcing a confrontation that will shock even the most seasoned observers. But let's start from the beginning. Officer Michael Randolph, a seasoned veteran of the force, was well acquainted with the routine of mediating disputes. That morning, his dispatch sent him to a weathered apartment complex on the fringes of town, its cracked paint and sagging balconies bearing witness to years of neglect. The complaint was straightforward. A landlord reported an unruly tenant refusing to pay rent, causing disturbances for the building's residents. At the scene, Michael was greeted by Mr. Thompson, a middle-aged man whose disheveled suit and shifting eyes suggested both irritation and unease. "That guy, Henry Wallace," Thompson declared, jabbing a finger toward a second-floor window. "He's been a nightmare. No rent for months. Ignores every call. He thinks he can do whatever he wants." Michael nodded, clipboard in hand, and took in the familiar narrative. A frustrated landlord and, more often than not, a struggling tenant trying to scrape by. As he climbed the creaky staircase to the second floor, he mentally prepared for the confrontation that was surely coming. When the door opened, Michael was momentarily taken aback. Standing before him was not the disheveled figure he'd expected, but Henry Wallace, a sharply dressed black man whose poised demeanor radiated control. "Good morning, officer," Henry said with an air of practiced calm. "What seems to be the issue?" Michael cleared his throat, momentarily thrown by the contrast between Thompson's portrayal and the man before him. "We've received a complaint from your landlord," he explained. "He claims you haven't paid your rent and are refusing to vacate the premises." Henry leaned casually against the doorframe, his arms folded in a gesture of quiet confidence. "Did he show you any documentation proving he owns this building?" he asked, a subtle challenge in his voice. Michael's gaze flicked back to the staircase, where Thompson now stood visibly fidgeting, his face betraying a flicker of anxiety. "I don't need to see that," Michael replied, adopting a more authoritative tone. "The complaint is enough for action." Henry exhaled lightly, motioning for Michael to step inside. "Then you'll want to see this," he said, his calm tone unsettling Michael just enough to pique his curiosity. Against his instincts, Michael followed. Henry Wallace calmly handed Officer Michael Randolph a neat stack of documents. "These are the property deeds," he began, his voice steady but tinged with irritation. "I purchased this building 5 years ago. Mr. Thompson, back then, was in deep financial trouble and sold it to me to cover his debts. Since then, I've been the sole owner and landlord." Michael furrowed his brow as he examined the paperwork. The legal documents, with their official seals and precise language, appeared legitimate. But this revelation clashed starkly with the complaint he'd received. "If you own the building, why would he go to such lengths to report you?" Michael asked, his skepticism apparent. Henry sighed, the weight of months of harassment momentarily cracking his calm demeanor. "Because I've been working to turn this place around," he explained. "The building was in terrible shape when I bought it. Leaky roofs, broken heating, you name it. I've been investing my time and money to renovate it, making it livable and offering units at fair, affordable rates. Thompson doesn't like that he's no longer the one calling the shots." Michael glanced back toward the staircase, where Thompson lingered nervously, his face betraying mounting discomfort. Henry continued, "He's been spreading rumors about me, harassing the tenants, and, as you've just seen, filing false complaints. He thinks if he causes enough trouble, I'll get fed up and leave." Michael turned to Thompson, his expression now one of stern suspicion. "Is this true?" he demanded. Thompson's face reddened, and he stumbled over his words, muttering about misunderstandings and clerical errors. Michael's patience thinned. "You're wasting police resources," he said, his tone sharp. "Do you understand the consequences of filing a false report?" Thompson's silence was damning, and Michael's frustration grew. Yet, as he turned back to Henry, he found himself unsettled by the man's unshaken composure. It wasn't just confidence. It was the quiet resolve of someone who'd fought battles before and was ready to keep fighting. Questions swirled in Michael's mind, unsettling the assumptions he'd brought with him to the scene. Something about this case and Henry's story was far from over. Over the following days, Officer Michael Randolph found himself unable to let the case rest. Something about the encounter with Henry Wallace stuck with him, a mixture of unanswered questions and a gnawing sense that he might have been complicit in a greater injustice. Determined to understand the full story, Michael dove into the details, reviewing public property records, interviewing tenants, and retracing the history of the apartment complex. What he uncovered surprised him. The records clearly showed Henry as the rightful owner of the building, with documentation dating back 5 years. But it was the tenant interviews that truly painted a picture of the situation. Many spoke highly of Henry, praising him for his fairness and dedication. They described how he had personally overseen renovations, repaired long-neglected infrastructure, and even worked with tenants struggling financially to keep them housed. Yet, not everyone shared this positive perspective. A few tenants, though hesitant to speak freely, mentioned that Thompson had been spreading damaging rumors about Henry. Some claimed he had even resorted to subtle intimidation, implying that the building's real owner would return and that staying in Henry's favor might not be wise. Curious and increasingly uneasy, Michael sought another conversation with Henry. This time, Henry shared more of his story. "This isn't the first time I've had to fight for what I've earned," he said. "Growing up in a low-income neighborhood, I saw firsthand how people like me are pushed to the margins. I worked hard, college, saving every penny, hustling to buy this building. And still, people like Thompson look at me and think I couldn't possibly be the one in charge." Hearing this, Michael felt a pang of guilt. "I walked into that building thinking I knew exactly what the problem was," he admitted. "I assumed Thompson was just another overburdened landlord. And you? Well, I assumed wrong. I didn't question his word or my own bias." For Michael, the experience was humbling. The more he learned about Henry, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about a single dispute. It was a reflection of systemic bias, and he'd been blind to it until now. With evidence in hand, Officer Michael Randolph took swift action, filing a formal report against Mr. Thompson for harassment and submitting documentation of the fraudulent complaints. But Michael didn't stop there. Realizing that this case was emblematic of a larger problem, he reached out to his network of community leaders, landlords, and city officials. Within weeks, he organized a public forum to address the issue of racial bias in property disputes, using Henry Wallace's experience as a case study. The forum was eye-opening for many. Henry, invited to speak, shared his journey from growing up in a low-income neighborhood to becoming a property owner, emphasizing the challenges he faced, not just in acquiring the building, but in maintaining respect and fairness in the face of prejudice. "People see a black man in charge and assume he doesn't belong," Henry said. "But I'm here to show that we do belong, and we can succeed." The story resonated deeply, and the local news picked it up, broadcasting Henry's efforts to revitalize his building and offer affordable housing. The coverage drew widespread support from neighbors and activists, many of whom rallied to assist Henry with donations, volunteer labor, and public endorsements of his mission. Meanwhile, the backlash against Thompson was swift and unrelenting. Faced with mounting legal trouble, public criticism, and a tarnished reputation, he issued a public apology for his actions, claiming they were misguided. Shortly thereafter, he quietly sold his remaining properties and left town. For Michael, the entire experience was transformative. It forced him to confront his own assumptions and biases, making him realize that upholding the law wasn't enough. True justice required actively addressing the systemic inequalities that perpetuate discrimination. He began advocating for reforms within the department, focusing on training officers to recognize and challenge their biases. Henry's success didn't end there. With the newfound support of his community, he expanded his efforts, purchasing additional properties and mentoring other aspiring entrepreneurs. He became a beacon of hope and resilience, proving that perseverance could overcome even the most entrenched barriers. The once troubled apartment building stood as a symbol of justice and possibility. For those passing by, it was a quiet but powerful reminder. Appearances can deceive, but truth and determination can transform even the darkest situations into sources of light.